you see him on the news.
CNN.com contributor, Dean Obeidallah. So, Dean,
Watch him at comedy clubs.
When I say Mecca, do you think of a holy place or an urban clothing line?
Read his articles. And you hear him on the radio. The Dean Obeidallah Show is on live right here on SiriusXM Progress, channel 127.
And welcome to the show, brothers and sisters of the resistance, my fellow patriots. It is Thursday, November 8th. We are 2 days out from what was the biggest election of our lives. We look forward to the next biggest election of our lives. By the way, though, today, of course, there was a horrific mass shooting in California. 12 killed at a bar there. And it's interesting, in the last 2 weeks, how many Americans were killed by Trump's caravan? 0. How many Americans were killed by white, native-born people in mass shootings? Over 20. What should we be most afraid of? A caravan or native-born angry white men? That's a debate. You can debate that and get back to me on that one. But after the shooting, Senator-elect Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee, who's a member of the House, was interviewed about the shooting in California. And her response is, the way to protect Americans from more shootings is to make sure that we protect the Second Amendment, because that'll do it. There's not even words for that craziness. So we're going to play some comedy because we need to laugh. I think we've earned some laughs. By the way, tomorrow, Donald Trump is going to Paris tomorrow. Or as I call it, the suspect is fleeing the jurisdiction. But let's go to Stephen Colbert last night on Donald Trump's unhinged press conference yesterday. Here's clip number 1.
Major Garrett from CBS asked Donald Trump this.
Can you give us clarity, sir, on your thinking currently, now after the midterms, about your Attorney General and your Deputy Attorney General? Do they have long-term job security?
I'd rather answer that at a little bit different time.
Because a little bit later, because right now I'm having a hard time hearing any of these questions over the loud beating heart of Jeff Sessions hidden under my floorboards, okay? A little trouble stuffing the little guy down there. Get down. You've got to be able to hear it.
So, some fun there. And then Colbert got into something that no one who follows politics has ever seen. And that was Donald Trump yesterday literally ticking off by name Republicans who had lost and mocking them and chiding them for losing. Nobody's done that. Nobody has done that publicly, ever. And here is Colbert on that. Here's clip number 2.
But in his press conference today, Trump said this was great for the Republicans, and so was Trump.
We saw the candidates that I supported achieve tremendous success last night. Mia Love gave me no love, and she lost. And Barbara Comstock was another one. I mean, I think she could have won that race, but she didn't want to have any embrace. Peter Roskam didn't want the embrace. Eric Paulson didn't want the embrace. Those are some of the people that, decided for their own reason not to embrace.
I gotta say, I'm really surprised that stopped him, because he is not known for asking permission before he embraces.
Good joke. Very nice joke there by Mr. Colbert. And Donald Trump, those are real things, by the way, he mocked Mia Love, who's an African-American member of Congress from Utah, who's in a neck-and-neck race, has not officially lost yet, but it looks likely, not definite, but there's Donald Trump going, Mia Love gave me no love, and mocking the other ones who had lost. And then finally, here's Jimmy Kimmel last night, and these clips, and we're playing it for comedic effect, so I know a lot of people don't like to hear Trump, but Jimmy put it together from the press conference. This is not repeats. It's not edited in a weird way. This is literally how unhinged Donald Trump was in yelling at reporters during the press conference yesterday. At the same press conference, he began by saying, "What a great night for Republicans. We won big." And then this happened. Let's hear clip number 3.
He wasn't just mad at Jim Acosta. He lashed out at just about everybody.
Sit down, please. Sit down. I didn't call you. No, you rudely interrupted him. I don't know why you'd say that. That's such a racist question.
Some people.
Excuse me. Would you please sit down? Please go ahead. No, wait, sit down, please.
Thank you very much.
Why are you sit down?
Why are you pitting Americans against one another, sir?
Peter, what are you trying to be him?
Go ahead.
Mr. President, if it's unfair to the country,
give him the mic, please. I've answered the question. See, when you talk about division, it's people like this.
I hope someone had the sense to hide the nuclear button today.
What an unnerved, unhinged not president, just man. I wish the media would not call what Trump heads a presidential administration. They should call it the Trump regime, as in the illegitimate Trump regime, or the lawless Trump regime, or the illegal, criminal, family, aka Trump regime. They're not an administration. This is a regime. We're watching it right now with the firing of Jeff Sessions and the bringing in of a guy who looks like a James Bond villain to be the new acting attorney general. Looks like Lex Luthor from one of the old Superman movies. That guy, a complete political hack who should not be there. But as Congressman Mark Pocan told us yesterday, it doesn't matter if they fire Mueller in the lame duck session. It's not going to save Donald Trump. He even said Trump can hide, but he can run, but he can't hide. Because now the Democrats could subpoena actually Robert Mueller himself, even after being fired, to come before the House Judiciary Committee or the House Intel Committee and testify and bring other people and recreate the whole report in a way that all of America gets to hear everything, unfiltered. And let Republicans on the committee do their best to defend Donald Trump from his crimes. So we'll see what happens. But I want to talk about a quickly thing here, and then I'll take calls. We did so much better Tuesday as the more and more results come out. We did so much better Tuesday in the election than the mainstream media, even some liberal pundits, were letting on Tuesday night. And I understand why, because I was here as well. And I think for the liberal pundits and progressive pundits, who are my friends, there was the deep, deep disappointment in Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams not winning early on. I've got to tell you, though, there's a lot more going on. In fact, those races are now not over. There is more going on. And on election night, we knew we had taken the House. I went to sleep. We had the House. We didn't know the number. I knew we had 4 governorships. I wasn't sure. Now we have 7 governorships. But let's put this in perspective for a second. In 2006, it was called a blue wave election. That's the one where George Bush, after the midterm, said, we took a thumping over there. Thumping from the Democrats. Well, how many seats did the Democrats pick up in the House in that thumping? 32. How many governorships? 6. What is going right now? We have taken right now officially 31 House seats, but there are still right now 12 elections to be called, and NBC News is predicting, as of tonight, we will take between 35 and 40 House seats. That is a blue wave. We flipped 7 governorships from red to blue, and we were on the verge of taking 35 to 40 House seats. We didn't pick up some Senate seats. And it is more going on. First, Bill Nelson in Florida. It's a mandatory recount beginning this weekend because that race is within 0.5%. And in Florida, you don't even have to ask for it. It's a mandatory recount. Here's something else in Florida. Andrew Gillum, who conceded on election night. Everyone's like, I knew why he conceded. He saw the numbers. But people are like, why didn't he wait? Well, guess what? They have subtly walked back the concession. I don't want to get anyone too excited, but the margin of error, between the margin of votes between Ron DeSantis, the Republican, and Andrew Gillum has shrunk, and it's on the verge of 0.5%, which would trigger a mandatory recount. So I don't want you to get overly excited and go like, oh, we're going to get it. I'm not sure. But as ballots still come in, this is Florida. It's a big state. It could get to within 0.5%. We're not that far from it. But here's the other upside to what happened in Florida. Ron DeSantis got 4,066,000 votes. Andrew Gillum got 4,023,000 votes. Compare that to the last election for governor in that state, also in a midterm year, 2014. Rick Scott versus Democrat Charlie Crist, who was a very well-known guy there. Rick Scott got 2.8 million votes and won. 2.8 million. Andrew Gillum, 4 years later, gets over 4 million votes. How? Because Andrew Gillum now, through his work, his efforts, and the party's investment there, has built a new infrastructure, which delivered in an off-year election 4 million votes. If this was any other year, Andrew Gillum would be governor. He just slightly lost. Right? I mean, as of right now, the gap between DeSantis and Andrew Gillum is 40,000 votes in a state where over 8 million ballots were cast. 40,000 vote gap. And it is closing, and it might get within 0.5%. If it does, mandatory recount. And let's look what happened in Texas. In 2015, the last race for governor there, for Senate, John Cornyn, 2014 actually, midterm election, John Cornyn, 2014, running for Senate, 2.8 million votes he got. 2.8 million, he won easily. Beto O'Rourke this year got over 4 million votes. In just a 4-year difference, Democrats delivered 4 million votes. They delivered over almost 2 million more votes. How? Partly Wendy Davis in her last election built a new infrastructure, and Beto O'Rourke doubled and tripled down on that. So what you have now is states like Texas much more in play. Look, a lot of pundits say, oh, Florida is now a red state. The gap between Andrew Gillum and Ron DeSantis is closer than between Rick Scott and Charlie Crist 4 years ago. It's not growing red. It is getting tighter for us. And let's look what else is going on. Arizona right now, the gap between, and it's an open Senate seat, it was John McCain's seat, and the contest between the Democrat Kyrsten Sinema versus Martha McSally, the Republican. As of tonight, about 1.7 million votes were already counted. The gap between them, 17,000 votes. This is a red state, Arizona. The Democrat is just 17,000 votes behind, and there are over 500,000 votes still to be counted. So that could go either way. And look what's happened in Arizona. The state, so on some level, we walk away and we go like, oh my gosh, what happened? Well, racism and voter suppression happened in Florida, there's no doubt. And Georgia, to me, is the anatomy of how to steal an election. In fact, right now in Arizona, the Republicans have filed a lawsuit to not count certain mail-in ballots. They want to prevent certain ballots from being counted. You know they're from counties that are going to help the Democrat because they're panicking. And what happened in Georgia, to me, is a crime. But the good thing is there might be a runoff. It's not definite yet, but the gap between Stacey Abrams, the Democrat, and Brian Kemp, the criminal, was much wider. It was like 100,000 votes at one point, then 75,000. Right now, as we sit here, it is 63,000 votes. If the gap just reduces another 15,000 votes, the result is there's a mandatory runoff next month. Because in Georgia, it's one of these rare states that you need 50% of the vote to be declared the winner. And so this gap is getting closer. And right now, you've got Stacey Abrams is in the courts. Democrats are in the courts. There's not a recount going on yet. They're trying to push for it. They're trying to get it, at least Brian Kemp, down below 50%. So it's a mandatory runoff in December, which the whole nation will watch. And it'll make it so much harder for Brian Kemp, who resigned today as Secretary of State in Georgia because he did enough voter suppression so he could take a day off, apparently, that the whole nation will be watching. It would be much harder for them to cheat there. But I'm not going to tell you this to depress you, because the fear of when we talk about voter suppression is that some on our side check out. And I want to talk about, though, what happened in Georgia as a case study for why we need a federal law, a new Voting Rights Act, a brand new one on a national level here. What we saw in Georgia is a Jim Crow era concerted criminal effort to suppress African-American voters. That's exactly what Brian Kemp did. Carol Anderson, the professor from Emory, who's been on the show twice, last time a few weeks ago, had a great article today in The Atlantic laying it out, and she's the expert. She has a great book. I really recommend it. One Person, No Vote, about the history of disenfranchisement of African-American voters in this nation's history. And I dare you not to read it and want to throw the book at the wall or punch a wall, because it is so frustrating and so angering to see what these white conservatives did, from laws to worse, to killing black people, literally killing them for simply wanting to exercise what everyone else takes for granted, voting. So what did Carol Anderson? This is remarkable. You have to hear what Brian Kemp, sinister and diabolical. He is the Secretary of State until today. He was in charge of the election. He ran against Stacey Abrams. And leading up to this election, which he knew he was going to run for, he did everything he could to suppress votes of African Americans. As Carol Anderson put in her article, in the last 2 years, 2016 to 2018, Brian Kemp has eliminated 10% of voters from the Georgia state rolls. We're talking about over 1 million voters gone. From 2013 to 2016, he blocked the registration of nearly 35,000 Georgians. That's then. This year, it gets even worse. Days before the deadline to register this year, and this got a lot of press, and she came on the show, Carol Anderson, to talk about this, Kemp put a hold on 53,000 applications because of exact match problems, which some named already matched someone who already registered, so they're not going to let them vote. Of those 53,000 names they were holding, 70% were black, in a state that's only 30% African American. Again, if 15,000 votes changes in this election, we're going to have a mandatory runoff. Brian Kemp held back 53,000 votes. On election day, it continues. In 3 counties in Georgia, Fulton, Gwinnett, and Cobb, there were election voting machine problems. Fulton, Gwinnett, and Cobb. And what a coincidence, those are counties that deliver Democratic votes. What a coincidence, huh? Isn't it weird? The guy running the election, and in the counties where Democrats vote the most, they had election problems. Were huge, long lines. People had to give out free pizza and beg people to stay for hours and hours and hours. And more than that, Brian Kemp had shut 214 polling places in the last few years in Georgia, and guess where they were? The bulk of them in minority and poor neighborhoods. Brian Kemp has been waging a campaign of voter suppression for years to lead up to this day. Now they have up to November, not tomorrow, to count every single vote. If the gap closes within 15,000 votes, we're going to have a runoff next month. I hope we do. I think Stacey Abrams would beat him because I think the nation would watch. Maybe send in UN monitors to monitor an American election in Georgia because it's like a banana republic down there. Thanks to Brian Kemp. And you can make a donation. I made a donation today to Stacey Abrams' provisional ballot campaign, they're calling it, through Act Blue. Check it out. Any amount will help them. They're fighting hard. But here's my bigger point. I tell you about this case study in crime, this case study in voter suppression, this case study in denying the legacy and disrespecting the legacy, as Oprah Winfrey talked about when she was in Georgia last week, of African Americans who were killed simply for the right to vote. So what do we do besides getting angry? Well, there's one thing, go to the courts, and you can still do that, thankfully. But I think we need the Democrats on a national level. And I talked about the Congressman Pocan last night. I'm going to talk about with every congressperson, man or woman who comes on this show, to push for a new Voting Rights Act, a brand new one that is much broader than the one that's been gutted by the Supreme Court. And so we're all up to speed. Let me give you a little history of the Voting Rights Act and why it was implemented and why it is still relevant today. The Voting Rights Act, enacted in 1965, right in the language of the law itself, it says an act to enforce the 15th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. What was the 15th Amendment? I think most people know. If you don't, it says the right of citizens of the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The amendment goes on to say Congress will have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Hence, the Voting Rights Act was intentionally to enforce the 15th Amendment. And as most people know, the 15th Amendment was one of 3 post-Civil War amendments to pass to simply give African Americans and former slaves at the time equality. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th Amendment said everybody born here is a citizen, birthright citizenship that Trump wants to get rid of. That was enacted so slaves who were denied citizenship because of the horrific Dred Scott decision were guaranteed by our Constitution that if you're born here, you're a U.S. citizen, and that we have equal protection in the law, and the 15th Amendment was voting. So in 1965, Voting Rights Act passes, and it bans expressly the use of literacy tests and poll taxes, and that was all used by white conservatives to disenfranchise African Americans when they weren't using violence. It also authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act said no voting qualification or prerequisite to vote or standard practice or procedure shall be imposed or applied by any state to deny or abridge the right of any citizen of the U.S. to vote on account of race or color. Not to get too legal, what happened was, as most people know, the Shelby County Supreme Court decision in 2013 gutted the Voting Rights Act. It is now essentially inoperable. 5-4 decision. Guess who the five were? All conservatives. The 4 were all liberals. And then this lawsuit was brought by Shelby County in Alabama, and they were onto the declaration that the enforcement part of the Voting Rights Act, the part where it said which states and counties it applies to, was unconstitutional. Supreme Court goes, yep, it's unconstitutional because it's an old formula. Doesn't apply anymore. Doesn't make sense. They said, Congress, you can update it, knowing Congress wouldn't do anything, and that's where we are. And I say voting is the most important civil right of our era because the right to vote preserves all other rights. It's not the Second Amendment. It's not guns. It's voting. And, you know, I look back at some clip here, and I want to play a little clip here. This is Martin Luther King, 1957, before the Voting Rights Act, when he was out there, before the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, delivering a famous speech, Give Us the Ballot. And why give us the ballot? I want to play about a minute of this clip because it still rings true today in 2018. The words of Martin Luther King back in 1957. Let's hear clip 4.
So our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Yes. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice.
So there was Martin Luther King in 1957 talking about give us the ballot. He also mentioned the need for an anti-lynching federal law. By the way, that never was passed. In fact, just a few months ago, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Tim Scott, a Republican African-American from South Carolina, introduced legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So what Martin Luther King asked for in 1957 still is not law today. Now, in states they have it, but not a federal law. In any event, here's my thing. We need a new Voting Rights Act, not just to update, it was a brand new one, which says that any changes to any voting laws that imposes a voter ID or changes early voting days or has any significant or substantial impact, we can use either, I say significance better, on the right to vote for anybody has to get DOJ clearance. Because one of the reasons the Supreme Court struck down this provision of the Voting Rights Act is that it only applied at the time to 9 states and a few counties and said that was unfair and it should be updated. Well, I have a good remedy. Apply it to every state and every county in this nation, because at the time when they applied the Voting Rights Act 1965, they never contemplated that what were liberal states in the North, if Republicans took control, like Wisconsin, would try to implement laws to disenfranchise African-American voters and voters of color. And because it talks about of color, right? Race, same thing in the Constitution. I think we need a Voting Rights Act that applies to any changes that might have a significant impact on your right to vote in any way, including closing down voting stations where it's targeting minority communities. And you need DOJ clearance to do that, because when we had that, this was not happening. But since 2013, since the Supreme Court, the conservative justices who do not live in the real world said this is all a thing of the past, it's not really a threat anymore, it's clearly a threat. And since that decision, all of these former states that were part of the Voting Rights Act that needed clearance from the DOJ before they could change their law, guess what they did? They changed the law to make it harder for African Americans and Latinos and poor people in general, knowing all three, to focus though on African Americans in many of these communities. So you cannot vote. This is where we are in this country. We are still fighting the fight of Martin Luther King in 1957. Simply the right to vote. So let's take a break. I'm going to take calls right to the top of there. I'll be right back. 866-997-4748. Progressive values are the best of American values, and we need to keep fighting for them to save our country.
Don't go anywhere. This is the Dean Obadala Show on Sirius XM Progress 127.